Okay, you can turn in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11 and see if that doesn't mess with our sound system. It might. That might be the thing. Hebrews chapter 11, I will find it in my Bible as well. And we are starting, of course, picking it up where we left off in verse 20. And I'm going to read verse 20 through verse 20. Let's see. 27. Verse 27. Hebrews 11 verse 20 says, "By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible." God, we look to you, even though you're the invisible one. We look to you with the eyes of faith, looking to the reward, looking to the blessings that are in that city prepared for us, the city with foundations, whose builder and maker is God. We look forward to something better than anything we've seen, and we put our faith in you, knowing that the best is yet to come. God, we look back at the cross and thank you for all the blessings already purchased for us. We thank you for the redemption, for the forgiveness of sins, and we look forward to your soon return. We look forward to seeing you face to face, to being with you. That's what we're hoping for. That's what we're looking forward to. Until then, reveal yourself to us through your word and through the preaching of it this morning. We ask these things in your name. Amen. Amen. Faith. Back in Hebrews chapter 6, which was a long time ago, we were in Hebrews chapter 6. But in Hebrews chapter 6, the author was telling his readers that he was hoping to get into some real weighty doctrinal issues, some deep theological stuff, and he was hoping they would be ready for it. And he says that they ought to be leaving the elementary principles, meaning let's move on from the basics, guys. Let's go on to some really deep stuff. I want to talk to you about the deep things of the faith. And he was saying, I'm not sure you're ready. I don't think you can handle this. And he was saying, let's move on from the basics. Foundations are meant to be built on. They are not a substitute for a whole house. And that's what he's hoping to do in Hebrews, is to build on a foundation. He lists the basics in Hebrews 6 that he was hoping to move beyond. And one of those foundational doctrines was faith in God. And he was saying, let's build on that. Let's develop that theme. Let's not go back to having to explain what faith is, having to redefine faith, but let's start with that foundation and build on it, and so we can actually get somewhere and see some stuff done. He's saying we shouldn't have to explain and re-explain the importance of having faith in God. Now in Hebrews chapter 11, we're stuck on faith. Okay, it's the faith chapter. We've already seen that we must believe that God is. That's pretty basic. I would think that we could all agree on that. We saw that without faith, it is impossible to please God. That's also pretty basic. And some commentators and Bible teachers have suggested that the whole of Hebrews 11 is the author's way of discussing this very basic thing that he really wished he could move on from. Some say that all of Hebrews 11 is the very basic stuff, but we're actually getting deeper than some mere basics now. Not all the examples of faith are equal. They're different. And we're building on the basics of faith and getting to deeper faith and deeper faith and understanding the textures and the faith from different angles. The foundation has been laid. The faith in God that the author was hoping to build on, that has been presented. We must have faith in God to please Him. We have to believe that He exists. That's basic. Where do you build on? What do you build on that? Where do you go from that? Well, I believe in God. And as James says, in his, rough and tumble, blunt book, yeah, you say you believe in God, you do well. Even the demons believe. And Trim was like, well, thank you for that pat on the back. I think you knocked the wind out of me. We've had the basics. Believe that God exists. I think we're probably all on that same page there. We've done that page. Let's turn that page and then go on to the deeper things. Let's build on that foundation. The foundation has been laid, and the author of Hebrews is now building on it with each example of men and women of the faith being, another living stone being built on this foundation. We're getting more and more understanding of this faith. And the examples we start with this week, we're coming in halfway through the chapter, and the examples we get this week are not simple. They are not basic. They are not ground floor, bottom drawer truths. We're digging deep into our Bible study here because the truths they're not right on the surface. For example, look at the first person here in verse 20. It's Isaac. It says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. Now, I don't know how well you remember the story of Isaac blessing Jacob and Esau, but faith is not something you see clearly in that story. If you had to describe Isaac's behavior in that circumstance, man of faith would hardly be the first title that you would reach for. Let me remind you of the details of the family situation. Isaac is Abraham's son. He's inherited the promise. Okay? He's the heir to the covenant. He married a girl named Rebekah, but they couldn't have kids. That's a big problem, not only because infertility is a burden that weighs on many couples, but because the promise that God had given him was that he would father nations. And it's hard to father nations when you're not the father of anything. So Isaac prays, right thing to do. Rebekah conceives, and she says, there is something crazy going on inside my body. And she prays, again, the right thing to do. And God says, you've got twins. And in Genesis 25:23, God says, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Esau was the older that was told, God said from conception, from before birth, that he would serve the younger, Jacob, Esau and Jacob. God had already declared that Jacob would be the heir, but growing up, Isaac, their father, thought otherwise. He liked Esau better. Esau was more of a manly man. Jacob was kind of a mama's boy. Esau hung out with his dad. Jacob hung out with his mom. And Isaac liked Esau better. Growing up, Esau didn't care for spiritual things. And Jacob became tricky. And this family doesn't have a whole lot of good guys in it, I'm afraid. Jacob is tricky. Esau doesn't care about spiritual things. And all 4 of them, mom, dad, and the twins, are deceitful. And it finally comes time for Isaac to pass on the blessing to one of his sons. And he chooses to bless Esau instead of Jacob, but doesn't tell Jacob or his wife Rebekah that he's going to do it. But Rebekah overhears it because secrets have a way of getting out. He's going to bless Esau instead of Jacob, going against what he knew God had said would happen. See the faith yet? Because I'm missing it. His wife Rebekah hears the scheme because tent walls are thin. And she comes up with one of her own schemes. She disguises Jacob to feel like Esau. Isaac was blind. Esau was hairy. So they put a bunch of hair on Jacob so they'd figure it out. They send him in to steal the blessing. I don't know if you can do that. You steal the blessing that was intended for Esau that was actually intended for Jacob in the first place. Do you see the faith yet? I don't. Not yet, anyway. But I'll show you where I do see the mustard seed of faith, and this is a small mustard seed. Isaac realizes his plans on tricking the designs of God had been thwarted. He does bless Jacob, thinking he's Esau. Esau comes in and says, I'm Esau. Isaac says, I don't know what just happened, but this is terrible. All of my plans have fallen through, and I accidentally blessed the son I didn't want to bless that God wanted blessed in the first place. This is a fun family to have dinner with, I'm sure. He realizes he had been tricked though. And Esau says, well, take it back, Dad. Give me the blessing. Just take it back. Like, do something mean to my little brother here. I'm your favorite. Bless me. And Jacob says, instead of blessing Esau, he says in Genesis 27, verse 33, indeed, he shall be blessed. Speaking of Jacob. Now, he had already blessed him, thinking he was Esau. But he saw what had happened. He saw that he had been tricked. The tricker had been tricked. And he just said, indeed, he shall be blessed. And his faith response, the only faith response I can see in here, was nothing more than a surrender. A statement of, okay, God, you win. You saw my trickery, and then you allowed me to be tricked, but you have had your way. You will have your way. You will continue to have your way, and I know that your way is best. Indeed, he shall be blessed. This may not satisfy the intellectual quandary of this passage for some. Where's the faith? But that's all I've got. That's all I see. Okay? Isaac's act of faith was an act of surrender, and sometimes that's our act of faith as well. For many of us, this was our born-again moment, right? This was your conversion experience. The moment you became a Christian may have been that moment that you said, okay, I give up. Okay, I give up. I'm done. Whatever. God, just whatever. Now that doesn't sound like the sinner's prayer that you heard at the Billy Graham, crusade, but the okay, God, whatever may have been your surrender, saying, I'm blind, I'm crippled, I'm hungry, I'm broken, and you, God, have had a plan this whole time that I've been trying my best to thwart, and it hurts to kick against the goads, but okay, I get it now, you win. Perhaps that's all the faith that you can muster. And you feel like your faith is weak and a disappointment, but listen, if this is your act of faith, then let this be your act of faith. And stop fighting. Let that be the mustard seed that grows. It's an okay thing to say, thy will be done, after you've tried everything possible to have your will be done. It's okay to stop that, find the end of the line there and say, thy will be done. Isaac blessed his children in faith. What faith? The faith of surrender. He didn't go back on his word. He didn't fight back after he figured out, it's like, okay, we gotta kill Jacob now. That's what Esau's plan was. It was just to kill his brother, and then how's he gonna be blessed then, huh? And he doesn't do any of that. We don't have the conversation recorded between him and his wife, but I can't imagine it being really pretty. But he doesn't fight. He surrenders. He didn't try and conjure up a better blessing for Esau. He figured out the scheme before he blessed Esau, and then he blesses Esau with knowledge, and he blesses his sons according to the faith of a man who has been bested by God and who leans back into God's plan after fighting against him. That is faith, make no mistake. Surrender, an act of surrender like this, after you have been the enemy of God, saying, uncle, that is an act of faith. Surrender is an act of faith. Don't underestimate this kind of faith. I'm not saying that there's value in fighting against God, but there is always inestimable value in surrendering to Him after the fight. And that's where I see the faith in Isaac. Now, what about Jacob? Jacob, he wasn't one of the good guys in that story, if you remember. He was the lying guy saying, yes, I'm my big brother, stealing the blessing, that kind of thing. And it says that he has faith. In verse 21, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. First off, we see that this is many, many years after. God has been dealing with him for decades at this point in time before his faith comes out as something worth mentioning. But first we see that Jacob was blessing his grandchildren when he was blessing his grandchildren by faith, he was worshiping. When Isaac was trying to bless Esau, under the radar, he wasn't doing so in worship. When Isaac said, indeed he shall be blessed, I give up, that was the beginning of worship. when Jacob is blessing his grandsons, and we'll talk about this story, he was doing so in worship. It says he blessed them while he was leaning on the top of his staff, worshiping. His words have to do with, these kids, the ones he's blessing, but the focus of his heart is Godward. Worship is not horizontal. Worship is vertical. It's looking up towards God. Remember one of the definitions of biblical faith that we've been using in this study? Faith is the gaze of the soul upon a saving God. And Jacob was blessing his children, his grandchildren, but he was focused on God. And parents and grandparents, I'm pretty sure there's application here. I'm pretty sure you can listen to this part. When you want to bless your child or your grandchild, you have to keep your own heart worshiping. Don't focus on the kid. No matter how old they are, you'll be able to bless them more. You will be more of a blessing to them if your heart is completely united in its focus towards God. Now let's broaden those specifications a bit. People, whether or not you're a parent or grandparent. If you want to bless others, if you want to be a blessing to the world around you, keep worshiping. The blessing that sticks, it's the one that's done while the person is worshiping. We talked about this a little bit when we looked at the faith of Noah, if you can remember. But here it is again. Faith in God blesses the world. Your faith in God ought to have an effect on the world around you. Your focus on Jesus has great benefit for the people around you, because as you focus on Jesus, you'll become more like Jesus, and Jesus was and is blessing people. He is a blessing to people. But let's be more specific with Jacob's blessing here. It doesn't mention his blessing of all the kids. He blessed all his sons, but it mentions his grandsons. And there was something peculiar about these blessings, the sons of Joseph. And the peculiar thing was that Jacob blessed the younger with the blessing of the older, just like he had received. When Joseph, Jacob's son Joseph, brought his sons and said, "Dad, I want you to bless your grandchildren." And he puts his older son in front of Jacob's right hand of blessing, and puts the little brother next to the left hand, and Jacob does a switch. And Joseph gets upset and he says, no, you don't understand. He says, "No, I understand, because I've been here. I understand." And he blessed the younger with the blessing of the older. Now, I don't know if Jacob was responding to some sort of divine whisper that God actually said, "Hey, switch hands. That'll mess with him." I don't know. I don't know if that happened. But I do know that Jacob, who was the younger of two brothers, was remembering how God had blessed him with the greater blessing despite his own cunning and his own shortcomings, his own rebellion. And it says he blessed them by faith while he was worshiping. And I do want you to understand something about faith. Faith is both a looking forward and a looking back. We usually understand faith to be future focused, and I have kind of emphasized that point. But it is a forward motion, forward looking faith, but it is not that exclusively. Jacob is giving future blessings that were set on the precedent of past blessings. He knows it works. He knows you can switch up the order because he was in that situation. He knows that the one who doesn't deserve the blessing, or the one who you don't expect to be blessed, can be blessed by God. And his faith in blessing Joseph's boys, Ephraim and Manasseh, was in part due to what God had done for him years and years before. Our faith ought to work in much the same way. It is a future-focused faith. We have a future-focused faith, to be sure. We are looking to heaven. We're looking to that interaction that we get when we see Jesus face to face, and he says, "Hey, it's good. We're good. Good and faithful servant, come on in." Okay, we're looking forward to that. That's a good goal to be looking forward to. We're looking for progress, for improvement, for growth. But the faith that we have in the future blessings of God are firmly fixed on the past actions of Christ. Did you know you're saved by works? What? That's terrible. Not yours, of course. Christ's. You're saved by the work he did on the cross. Okay? You're saved by the works of Christ, and all of your blessings, future, all the hopes we have for tomorrow and a million years from now are firmly fixed on an actual event in history, the crucifixion, the resurrection. And those events provide us with confident hope in the fulfillment of the future promises of God. And we can say all the promises in Him are yes and amen because of the cross. And we can say we will be blessed with that blessed assurance because of what has already happened. We've seen the blessings. Our sins have been put away. Christ is risen from the grave. And even if we were to narrow eternity down a little bit, and just look at our own short lives, we can see how God has blessed us contrary to what we deserve. Obviously, that's called grace. And that gives us hope in the future blessings of Christ, whether or not we're planning on deserving them or not. We are like the second-born getting in on the firstborn's blessing because Jesus is God's firstborn. Jesus is God's only begotten Son. And being adopted as sons and daughters afterwards, we're actually benefiting with the same blessing that Christ receives. And since this has happened to us, we have faith to receive the blessings of God and to be a blessing in the hand of God towards those who are undeserving and ill-deserving, just like we are and were. Jacob's faith was a faith in the future that was based on the past. Our faith in the faithfulness of God is based on His past faithfulness. We have faith in the faithful one. Verse 22, let's talk about Joseph. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. Joseph, you remember, he had become Egyptian culturally. He had been sold by his brothers, sold that down the river. Okay, he went down to Egypt. He was very successful as a slave, but a slave nonetheless. But then became actually Pharaoh's right-hand man. During that time, he spent many years there. He became Egyptian for all cultural purposes. And it was because of his cushy government job that he got that his family was saved during the time of famine, and why they all moved down to Egypt. All his brothers and his father moved down to Egypt. And of course, when they got down there, they got comfortable. They stayed for 400 years and became slaves to the Egyptians. That ball started rolling in Joseph's own lifetime when he was cutting the deal with Pharaoh to let his brothers stay in the land of Egypt as shepherds. Joseph had lived the best years of his life in Egypt. His family, his wife, his kids, they were Egyptian. His home was in Egypt, but when he was about to die, he informed all of his relatives to not leave his bones in Egypt, indicating that he didn't consider this to be his real home. Now, he worked there, he lived there, he raised his family there, but it wasn't his home. And he prophesied that his family would be leaving Egypt eventually and be heading back to the promised land. Joseph believed the past promises of God, even though he wouldn't live to see them. He was dying in Egypt. Joseph was part of a family that had been promised a land, and his father had not inherited it, and his grandfather had not inherited it. And his great-grandfather, Abraham, though living in the promised land, was hoping for a better land, a city with foundations whose builder and maker was God. Joseph was part of this family, and he lived in Egypt, and he was dying in Egypt, but he was still not letting go of these long ago promised blessings that his family would inherit that land. And even though he was dying in Egypt, he refused to be permanently associated with Egypt. He commanded that even his bones be brought out of Egypt when the Jews would leave. And he knew they would leave because he commanded them. He says, when you go. Now that wouldn't happen for 400 years, but he saw it coming with the eyes of faith. He had faith in the promises of God. Now history tells us that Joseph's bones were never buried. They remained in a coffin above ground, in like a shrine of sorts, but visible, the coffin, not the bones. It wasn't like glass. That'd be weird. The coffin was certainly accessible, and we know this because on the night of the Exodus from Egypt, the Jews did take the bones of Joseph with them. And if you remember the story, they didn't have a whole lot of time, for prep work, time for grave robbery and things like that. They had to get up and go. And part of that getting up and going was grabbing Joseph's coffin on their way out. So it was above ground, accessible, ready to go for 400 years. Excuse me. And this means, of course, that the location of Joseph's bones were known and accessible for the last 400 years before the Exodus. And people could walk by this shrine or his coffin or whatever and ask, well, what's that about? Like, no pyramid for this guy. You should at least bury him. Like, this seems kind of like, you know, you're not quite done with this job, are you? You know, usually you put him in the ground. And the people with good memory or who have been keeping good records would be able to tell you, well, this is Joseph, and he requested that he not be buried in Egypt, but in the Promised Land, where God will eventually take us. And his bones would serve as a reminder for generations after his death that this isn't your home. Here's a guy who lived here, who was successful here, who raised his family here, but it's still not his home. His faith would extend beyond his life and would become an encouragement for generations to follow. Never underestimate the longevity of a true faith. The bones of Joseph would have served as a reminder to the people who lived their whole lives in Egypt that there was a homeland that would be given. There was something better coming. That Egypt wasn't their home, and that even if their whole lives were to be lived there, their hopes were to be set on something beyond even their life, something greater that was yet to come. Joseph's hopes were set on the Promised Land, and so are ours. And be assured of this isn't your home. I don't care if you live your whole life here, and if you raise your family here, and if you're successful here, that's all great, but you don't live here. This isn't your home. A life that is directed wholeheartedly towards heaven is a life that will remind others of the same. Even if your whole life is lived out on this earth, and let's face it, the odds are in favor of that happening, the hope of heaven can serve as a blessing to future generations even after you've gone. Okay, now we're going to jump a historical gap here of 400 years almost to the time of Moses. Verse 23. It says, by faith Moses, when he was born, now that's a good faith. He had faith as a baby. No, wait, keep reading. He was hidden 3 months by his parents. They're the ones who had the faith. Because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. And this is the faith of Moses' parents. The king's command here was a command to execute all male children born to the Jews. It was kind of a selective genocide. It was a command given in order to curb the overpopulation problem they were having. It's an interesting sentence here in Hebrews because it sounds like their faith was based on the good looks of their infant son, and then they lost their fear of the king's command because their baby was cute. I don't think this is what it's saying here. So let's just get that kind of false interpretation right out in the open so we can all deal with it. Obviously, every parent thinks their child is beautiful, so why would that even be worth saying? There's more to the word beautiful here than immediately meets the eye. In Acts chapter 7, verse 20, it's a good cross-reference for this verse if you're into that kind of thing. There's Stephen, the church's first martyr, and he is preaching his own funeral message. He's preaching his first and last message, okay, recorded for us in its entirety in Acts chapter 7. And he is giving the Jews their own history as it leads up to Christ. And he says that Moses was beautiful to God. This is what he says. He says, Moses is beautiful to God. And it is not a physical appearance that led Moses' parents to have the faith to disobey the king's command, but it was a spiritual recognition that Moses had, by grace, obtained a special favor from God, even from infancy, and was intended for great things. Although we would like to think that every parent was hiding their kids, and no doubt many of them did, the reason for Moses' parents hiding their son, the reason went far beyond just paternal love and maternal love, okay? It was done with a spiritual awareness that they were saving not only their son, but by some future work of God, the entire nation. And that was worth it to them. So they take their lives in their own hands and hide this baby for 3 months, and I don't know how anyone would ever hide a 3-month-old baby. And that's why they put him in the basket and sent him off. It says they did not fear the king's command. Now, they still hid the baby, so we know that they did realize the risks. Disobeying the king in this case would have probably cost them and their families their lives. But they did not fear in the sense that their faith in God overshadowed any fear that they might have had in the king or even in death itself. And here's a thing about fear you can jot down. Faith defeats fear. The "and" here in the sentence, "and they were not afraid," is correctly placed after a semicolon. It's a different part of the sentence, following the first part, but capable of standing on its own. The parents of Moses, and for a bit of trivia, their names were Amram and Jochebed, that is in the scripture. They acted in faith when they realized God's plan for their favored baby, and then it mentions their lack of fear. I would like to suggest that the complete confidence came after the initial act of obedience. Faith overcomes fear. It does. But remember that this is a faith that works that we're talking about. A working faith. A faith that leads you to obedience. That defeats fear. Moses had a rich heritage. He had parents who acted in faith, saved him. He had, Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in his line, in his family. So let's talk about Moses himself. If you want to learn about Moses, we'll be getting into the last third of his biography in our study in Numbers, in the midweek study. That will continue to go on even while I'm in Nepal, so you guys can keep coming to that. And we'll be getting to his story in a couple weeks. But in verse 24, Hebrews 11, it says, "By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter." Now this is interesting because this must be based partly on Hebrew traditions and are now confirmed by the Holy Spirit, by their presence in the book of Hebrews. But this isn't super clear in the book of Exodus. We do know that Moses, after living for 40 years as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, had a sort of identity crisis. He identified more with the Hebrews, who were slaves and being abused, than he did with the Egyptians, the upper class, the royal family that he was raised in. And he had this identity crisis, and he reacted in an unhealthy way. He should have just bought a motorcycle or something, okay? But instead, that's how you solve all identity crises, by the way. He murdered a man, which is the incorrect way to do something, anything. He murdered a man. There was an Egyptian slave driver beating a Hebrew, and Moses killed him and hid his body in the sand. Now I know that the vigilante in some of us makes us see a bit of justice, at least in his actions, but we have to confess that this wasn't justice. If it was justice, he wouldn't have hid the body and been secretive about the fact that he killed the guy. Murder isn't justice. There's a difference here. It was murder. I don't think that event is the event that Hebrews 11 is talking about, because there's not a lot of faith in murdering people. But I think it's talking about Moses' return to Egypt after the second 40 years of his life spent in the desert. See, when Moses returned, he would not have been considered a murderer. I read this week that ancient Egyptian law concerning homicide is much different than ours. Basically, if there was no one who was mad at you for the crime, you were good to go. Homicide was dealt with by the family or friends of the deceased, which I think probably has some of its advantages. Moses' life was sought by Pharaoh himself, a Pharaoh who most historians believe to have died during Moses' time in the wilderness. In other words, when Moses returned to Egypt, he had a clean slate. He would have come back, and he could have come back and said, "I was raised by the Queen Mother." He could have come back and said, "I'm a relative of the royal family," and he could have picked up right where he left off. And that's what makes this act of faith worth mentioning. Moses had spent the second 40 years of his life with sheep. His nearest relations are slaves, 100 miles away. Going back to palace life had to be enticing. But he never once in Exodus mentions anything about his past life as Egyptian royalty. He rather identifies himself as a Jew, refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And he calls himself a servant of the God of the Jews. In verse 25, It says, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. His faith led him to reject the pleasures of sin. Now, again, he could have stayed in that, if he didn't kill the guy especially, he could have stayed in the royal house for the rest of his life. But it calls it the passing pleasures of sin. Because pleasures of sin, even if they last until the day you die, are just a little, speck in eternity. And Moses recognized that. He said that the pleasures of sin would have been just passing. His faith led him to suffer with the people of God. And it may be tempting to stop with this verse and embrace a sort of poverty theology here that says we're more faithful when we're suffering. And while I don't want to scoff at the truth that working faith will lead you to uncomfortable places, we can't leave this verse by itself without the beautiful truth of verse 26. It says, Moses was esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. This is great. Here it is again, people. Moses was looking past the rewards of this life, just like Abel, just like Enoch, just like Abraham, just like Joseph. He lived by faith, but not in something that can be entirely realized in this earth. He was looking forward to the reward. And he was looking forward to something better. What's better? Or maybe I should say, who's the best? Jesus is the best. Now you might say, well, Moses wasn't really looking forward to Jesus, was he? He wasn't doing this for Jesus. I mean, he couldn't have that much of a far-sighted perspective. I love the New Testament. It says here that he considered the reproaches of Christ. Now that's a remarkable observation. Moses considered the reproaches of Christ. What does that mean? Does that mean he had an understanding of the cross, the resurrection, the ministries of Jesus? I don't know. He and God were close. They could have talked about a lot of stuff. Okay, but I do know that Moses did understand a lot about suffering for the sake of others. I do know that Moses understood what it meant to be rejected by the very ones he came to save. The reproaches of Christ that Moses is considering is not limited to his little fights with Pharaoh. Right, the Egyptians didn't like Moses, big deal. If you remember the story of the Exodus, Moses was criticized and rejected by the Jews. Did he back down? No. Why? Because he had God in his corner, and he had God's command, and with God's command comes God's anointing. And the anointing of God is a little bit like the foretaste of glory is divine that the old hymn speaks of. Moses may not have known many details about the coming of Christ, but whether he was aware of it or not, his reproaches were the reproaches of Christ in this sense. They were both God's anointed, each in their own way, and they were both rejected by men. They both endured the cross and despised the shame for the joy that was set before them. Moses experienced a parallel suffering that Christ suffered. And he considered those sufferings as better than treasures in Egypt. He considered the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasure in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Moses endured sufferings and reproaches. Reproach is a fancy word for insult, but worse. But he did so not because he saw some morbid value in suffering, but because he was seeking the reward. And with that reward in mind, the sufferings of Christ and the sufferings themselves had a greater value than all the treasures of Egypt. Listen, we're still talking about faith here. And here's something I don't want you to miss. With faith that is set on a God that is best, even the sufferings of this life can be paired with Christ in his sufferings. And in that, they can become beautiful. Now I'll say it backwards just so you get it both ways. Suffering, real suffering, can become something beautiful if it is shared with Christ. And this can be done through a faith that is fixed, that is a fixed gaze on Christ himself, who is the best. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you fall into various trials. Now those words just smack of empty Hallmark style encouragement if they are separated from the sufferings of Christ. But in that case, they become very real. The verse in James that tells us to count it all joy can sound like vacant words of, oh, it'll all get better. Just put a smile on. We know that doesn't work. But again, they're empty only if they're separated from the sufferings of Christ. If our sufferings are done in parallel with Jesus, if we are walking with God like Enoch did, traveling towards the same goal at the same rate on the same path, then the most remarkable thing can happen, and that is that we can say with Paul that even the worst of all our afflictions are light and momentary and not really even worth being compared to the glories that await us in Christ Jesus. We can say with Paul, I glory in my infirmities. Yeah, my weaknesses are the best things about me. You know why? Because that's where Jesus shows up. Knowing that it is by the grace of God and for the glory of God, even our sufferings, if our faith will take us there, can become joys. Now I'll repeat something from last week's text, something we saw in last week's text. The faith of God is not something to improve the quality of your life on this earth. Faith will lead you to sacrifice. Faith will lead you to affect the world around you, and the world might not always appreciate the effect you're having on it. Faith will lead you on a narrow path, and there are few who find it. It will lead you to an open door, but there are many adversaries. But it will be a walk with one who is faithful. And when have you ever walked alone? It will be a walk that is worth it because of the destination that is ever before your eyes. We're just going to do one more verse really quick, even though we're going to pick up in verse 27 next week too. But it just fits so well with what we're talking about here. It's the right place to close. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Moses spited one of the most powerful men on earth, but he did so because he knew the one who was more powerful still. And in this is faith. It is setting your eyes on the invisible, which has more weight than the visible. Please, set your eyes on the things above. Set your mind on the things above, where Christ is, where your life is, hid with Christ in God. Grow in your faith. Perhaps the only faith you can muster is the faith of Isaac. The faith of surrendering to God and just letting Him do the things without you trying to take the wheel. If that's all you've got, then go for it. Set your eyes on the things above, and let go. And perhaps your faith is more of the faith of Jacob, blessing the sons of Joseph, a faith that is based on what God has done for you in the past. He has been faithful to you. When have you ever walked alone? He has been faithful to you up till this very moment, hasn't He? Well then, guess what? He's got a really good track record. You have every reason to believe that He will continue in His faithfulness towards you. Share that blessing. I hope you are developing a faith like the faith of Joseph, who will believe God even to the death and who possessed a faith that outlasted even his life. And I hope that our faith may be the faith like the parents of Moses, the faith that they had, a faith of obedience, a faith that casts out fear. We can do this with the same kind of faith that Moses had, which is a faith that has its eyes fixed on the invisible, so that the sufferings of this age have value as they are eclipsed by Christ. Set your eyes on things above. Be eclipsed by Christ. Let's pray. Jesus, as we study and think about and feast on the things of God, give us your Spirit's wisdom and the faith of Jesus. Give us faith to put these truths into action. We look to you. Don't let us look away. God, increase our faith. And if it's just the faith of surrender, then we as a church and each of us individually say, we're letting go. Have your way, God. Thy will be done. And where that statement may lead us, only you know, God. But we're ready to be on that walk with you because we're looking forward to the reward. We're looking forward to seeing you face to face. And we're looking forward to the invisible, which has even more substance than the visible. Bless your church with a faith that works, and be pleased with the faith that we have. Let the mustard seeds grow, God, as they fall on good soil. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.